Hello, and welcome back to our series on beginning app script for HR, brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie HR Solutions, and in today's video, I want to go back and talk about in-depth loops. So our last video, we created a function to find an average, and instead of just running with this and then populating it up here in our code to return our salaries and populate, I'd like to take a second and actually talk about loops because we'll run into loops quite a bit, especially when we're dealing with arrays or if you start getting into things called objects. And we should have a we should have a good operational understanding of what they are and why they work because they really do come in handy. In fact, we've actually been using loop in a way with map and filter. So what we're doing, like right here with this filter, what we're doing is we are taking this two-dimensional array and we're going through that two-dimensional array and we're essentially saying we're going to return a line of data when the third index or that division column is equal to the value, which our value is would be operations in this case, or whatever's coming from that field. And then we're going to store this in that variable here as a new array. And we're kind of doing the same thing also with map, except we're not filtering it and collecting it. All we're doing is going through the array, which is this ops data. So it's this array that comes from our filter. And we are simply pulling out every instance of the index number 20, which is our salary. So I'd like to take a second and really go over loops a little bit more in depth because I know we used a for of loop here to provide our average, and I would like to explain what a loop is and actually how it works. So what a loop is, it's used to perform a task that you do over and over based on a condition. So this for of loop right here, instead of value, we could just put, I don't know, it could put anything in here, num, and then this would be num. So what we're doing here is this is what's called a for, and we'll just do some dots of loop. And this is used for iterating. And what I mean by iterating is going one element at a time over a list or array. And this for of loop can also be used in maps. So in our map method, we can use this for of loop. And what we're doing here is we are taking this array of numbers right here, and for loops work with numbers. In fact, they work best with numbers, in my opinion anyway. And we are declaring that we are going to use a for loop. And inside here, you can think of this as essentially letting an element, and this element we are simply calling numbers. So this num, this element, corresponds to each one of these elements in our array. And then we are saying of, and the numbers is our array. So if we had another array down here and we wanted to pull that array, we'd just use that variable. And then for each one of these elements in this numbers array, we want to do something. And that is what the squirrely brackets are doing. This is our code instructions, our code block. And what we're doing is we are saying that this sum variable, which we have set it 0 up here, we are wanting to change the value of that every single number. And what this little thing right here is, it may look confusing unless you've run into it before. This is what's called an operator. And when you have a plus and equal operator, it also acts as an assignment operator as well. So what it's saying is we want to add and then assign it every element. So what this plus equal is doing is it is taking the first element and then it's taking the second element and adding to that and then equaling it and summing it up and then equaling it to the sum. So it's taking every single number, adding it to the one preceding it, and then changing the value of this sum. So that's how we're actually getting the sum of all this. So let's look at a loop at its very basic form. And this is simply a for loop. So what we'll do is we'll just create another function down here and call it loop. So a for loop is very basic. It's the most basic, and it's used quite a bit. And the syntax of this is for. Of course, we need our parentheses, and then what we need is what's called an initialization, comma, and then we need the condition, comma, and then we need the increment, or we can also do a decreasing piece. And an increment, or decreasing or increasing, is either going to be plus plus or minus minus. So plus plus means that you want to go up by 1. Minus minus means that you want to go down by 1. And then what's going to happen is you need the code. And everything in here in this code block is what you want to run every time. So this can be anything, of course, but typically it's simply we'll just do code to run. So let's think of an example. We'll think of an easy example here, and let's comment that out. So let's give ourselves a nice little thought of numbers here. So say we want to count from 0 to 4. So what we can do is we can say 4, then our parentheses, and then we got to essentially declare a variable. And this initialization is often identified just across the board. It could be anything, but typically you'll see this called lowercase I. And then this is our starting point. So it's going to be 0. And then these should be not commas. These should be semicolons. I apologize. There we go. So that should be a semicolon. And then the condition we're wanting is, say I is, if we're wanting to count to 4, we need to make it less than 5. So every time we have an I starting at 0 that's less than 5, we want to make this true. And then we want to increase that by 1 every single time, every iteration. So we don't really need a variable here because we're just counting the numbers. We're starting at 0. 0 is obviously less than 1, so it's going to, count it. Or 5. 1 is less than 5, it's going to count it. 2, 3 is less than 5. 4 is less than 5. But 5 is not less than 5, it's equal to 5, so it's not going to count it. It's going to stop. And we can see this by logging this out. And all we want to do is we don't want to log the whole thing, but we want to log the variable that we declared, and that is I. So now let's save this. And now when we come down here to our loop function and run it, you'll see that we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if we were to say this is 6 and then run it, we'll pick up that 5. And there is something that is called, you can set a loop in a way that will run forever, a continuous loop. It's an infinite loop is the way it's called. It will just keep going. And one thing that would do that is if we started at 0 and we made this greater than, say, 1. If we were to run this, it would just continuously run until you powered off your computer or exited out. And the reason is because everything is going to be greater than 1 if it starts at 0. Or if you just do 0, then obviously that is just going to continue to run. So you can create yourself a situation in which this loop will always be true and continuously run. So we want to avoid those infinite loops. But again, if we go less than 10, increment by 1, then it's going to give us all the way up to 9, as you can see. Now, this doesn't necessarily need to be numbers. I mean, we could put I is equal to, say, a value like sales, and then the condition is if I equals sales, then do this. So we could loop through an array of data, and if you kind of think of what map and filter is doing, it's kind of doing the same thing. So we've already been doing this concept. We just haven't used it such as that. And we can also start at 10. And instead of saying less than 10, just make this 0. And then we can decrease by 1 and then run it. You'll see that it starts at 10 and it goes all the way up. It does not include 0 because 0, we're not saying it's equal to or less than or equal to. We're saying, or greater than or equal to in our case, we're saying that it's just simply greater. So we want to include the 0. So that's what a loop does. A loop goes through an array or a series of numbers and essentially does something every iteration. So let's think of another loop before we get back into our code here. So now let's think of what we used up here. For of loop. Let's make this syntax. And that syntax is for let, we want the elements of an iterable. So what an iterable is essentially that array that we set. This numbers up here. And then we're going to run a block of code. Code to run. And then we can, of course, log that out. So let's think of another way to do this. Let's use this one because we already did it. So that is our syntax. We're letting an element of an iterable or an array, and what we're wanting to do every single time to that element is this code. So we took our element, we took our array, every single element. What we are wanting to do again is grab each one of those elements, these numbers in here, add it to the last one or add it to the last result, and then set that value of sum. And then we created another variable down here that took that sum and then divided it by the length of this entire array. And then we logged it out and got our average. So arrays and looping through arrays are the two things that you will commonly use when dealing with spreadsheets in JavaScript or Google Apps Script. And just like this map and this filter function, the more you do it, the more you'll be able to see, oh, I see exactly what's happening and why it's happening. And then you're able to change these. Now, in your journey, you're going to come up with quite a bit of other loops. And, there's other loops. You have the for in loop, and I'm not going to get into these here because we haven't done an example of where we could use it. Instead of a for of loop, you could do a for in loop. And a for in loop is used for things such as objects. If you're not dealing with an array, if you're dealing with objects, that would be something you would use. And then, of course, you also have, let's see, you have for each. You have do while, just regular while loop. So there's quite a bit that you can do. And if you have the time, I would highly suggest you kind of dig in and play with the various types of loops, because certain loops do work better than others. And I typically use the for each loop when I am building out cascading drop-down boxes in like a web app or HTML from Google Apps Script, because it's allowing me to go through every single element of one and do something with that element and essentially create that cascading effect. So in the future, I'm sure I'll put together a video with cascading drop-down boxes inside an HTML form, and you'll see me use for each loop. So now let's go back to our code and actually take this for of loop here and build it into our code that we already have. We've essentially found a way to create an average between two numbers. Now, we're not obviously going to use these numbers, but the numbers that we're going to use exist in the form of this variable, which is the map of our filtered data for sales. So instead of numbers, we'll just pass this. So let's go ahead and copy the things that we want to copy. Let's just copy this here. And then we'll have to change it, of course. We'll just work on our sales for right now. So we can say the sum is 0, but let's instead, just for the sake of simplicity, we'll do sales sum is 0. And then we'll let the number of sales sum for every single item in, not sales sum, this should be sales salary, excuse me. Every element inside this sales salary, which is our salaries, we want to increase the sales sum by that element. And then this should be sales sum. We don't need the length of the numbers. What we need is the length of our sales salary array, which is the array of our salaries. So this should be sales salary, spell it correctly. And then let's do this as simply sales average. Now what we can do is take this sales average and push it to our sheet. So let's come over to our dashboard SS. We'll get range, and the range that we're going to need to get here is E3 or 3, 5. So that's going to be row 3, column 5. And then we want to set the value to our sales average. So now let's save this. And we need to remember that we are doing this with sales. Okay, so here we go. 3, 5, set the value to that sales average here. And let's go back over here to our sheet. We'll refresh our sheet. You go down to people analytics, division level. We could probably get rid of this company. I don't think we need that company really, because if we wanted company, we would just do company level. So we'll get rid of that too. But let's do sales. Pop it up to sales. Average head count, salary average is 69,921. So I can't remember how many people we actually have in our sales. I might have picked the wrong one. Okay, we have 2. So it's finding the average of those. Now, when we are working with salaries and we begin dividing salaries, that, the sum by, say, 5 salaries, we are inevitably going to end up with decimal points that go well beyond 2 digits. So we're going to have to actually ensure that we are only getting back 2 digits. And how we can do that is by simply using a toFixed method. So let me pause our video here, and I'm going to go through and copy this on the rest of these, just so you're not watching me type this out. And then we'll run this, and we'll find an instance to where the decimal points look just a little bit, screwy. And then we can go in and fix it. So let me pause this. I'll see you in just a sec. Okay, there we go. So I went ahead and I finished copying all these in here and changing what we needed to change. I went ahead and changed each of our variables and our references to ensure that if you were looking at this again, you would know exactly what belonged with what case in this instance here. Same with like ops, marketing, IT, HR, and finance. So let's go back to let's come back over here to our sheet here. We'll refresh it. And let's roll through our divisions here real quick, just to make sure everything's working and firing off correctly. Let's do finance. Okay, head count is 1, salary average 79,000. And we can format this using our app script if we wanted to set the format to currency. But for now, it's fine. It's functional. Okay, so HR has this 0.5 decimal. So even though we're not finding one, it doesn't look like anyway yet that it's carrying off to like 33333. There will be chances and instances to where we will encounter that. So we should just get ahead of that now, and I'll show you all how to do that. 8541, and then let's do sales. We already did sales, but just make sure it still works. Okay, good. There we go. So anytime that we are dealing with, anytime we're dealing with a number and we're doing some kind of calculation to that number, that may produce decimal places, what you can do is add to the end of this, and I put this in parentheses because I want this to run first, and then the product of that, I would like to control those decimal points. So when we use to fixed, it is a method, and inside these parentheses, it's going to ask for a number. And this number is how far out we want the decimals to be carried. So if we do this as 0, it's going to round up. If we do it at 2, then what we're saying is that we only want to go out to 2 decimal places. That third decimal place will then, round up this second one. And this will essentially take care of our cents if we're thinking of dollars. So we can add that to the rest of them, which I'll do a little bit later outside of this video, so you don't have to watch me do it. But I'm going to end this video here. Now that we have a functional code to run our average and then populate it, our next video, we're going to do some final cleanup of our code and maybe ensure that everything closes out and populates as necessary. And then I think that will be it for our series. Because remember, the intent of this series wasn't necessarily to create a product or a solution, so to speak. It was just to lay a foundational knowledge or operational knowledge of app scripts so you could take it and evolve it the way that you write, that you work, and to meet the solutions and needs of your own business. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed this video. And like I said, next time we'll go through and clean up this and finalize it and close this series out. So until then, please take care.